So for this session, let's just take a few minutes to refresh our motivation from earlier. So really do your best to bring into your mind love and compassion for others, as many other people and beings as possible. Really wish all living beings to have happiness and all good experiences, especially spiritual ones, up to enlightenment. And also for them to be free of all suffering and the causes of suffering, especially ignorance, other afflictions, and so on. And generate the wish that you yourself could help others as much as possible, help them be relieved of suffering, help them to find happiness. And our ability to help is probably very limited at this time, but if we develop our understanding and our wisdom, our other qualities that we can develop on the spiritual path, then we can become more and more able to help others. And see if you can have this aspiration and have this as your motivation for participating in this course. So I have a little bit more to say about the 5 remembrances, if those could be put back up on the screen. So in the sutra, which we'll make available for you, you can get it in the chat box if you want to read the whole sutra. So in the sutra, the Buddha first mentions these 5 and says it's good for people to reflect on them often. And then he explained why it's beneficial to do so, because if we don't reflect on these, then we can become intoxicated with youth or with good health or with life. And in that state of being intoxicated, we can become very careless about what we do and engage in misconduct, create negative karma, destructive actions, and so on. And with the 4th one, he said that we have desire and lust regarding the people and the things that are dear to us, and that can also lead us to engage in misconduct. And so reflecting that we will have to separate from all people and all things can help us to let go of the desire, the lust, the attachment that we have for them, and that will lessen the likelihood of engaging in misconduct. And then with the 5th one, which is about karma, the Buddha said that if we reflect on that, then we will abandon or diminish misconduct of body, speech, and mind. So if we think that the actions that we do will bring consequences that we will experience in the future. So if we get very familiar with that, then yeah, since we don't want suffering, we don't want problems, we don't want bad things to happen to us, then we will gradually decrease negative actions and increase positive, virtuous actions. And then, after that, the Buddha went on to say, a noble disciple reflects thus: I am not the only one who is subject to old age, to growing old. All beings that come and go, that pass away and undergo rebirth, are subject to old age. None are exempt from old age. So he advises that we think about these 5 things with respect to others as well. That every being who's still within samsara, the cycle of death and rebirth, they are also subject to these problems. And for those of us wishing to follow the Mahayana, the Bodhisattva path, then this is very helpful for cultivating compassion for others, the wish to help them, and loving kindness, the wish for them to be happy. So that's very helpful. But the Buddha in the sutra talks about how if we reflect that not only ourselves but all other beings are subject to these experiences, then this will motivate one to engage in the path, to follow the spiritual path, and eventually to become completely free of all afflictions. So he said that with regard to each of these 5. So contemplating each of these 5 in terms of other beings, how all beings are subject to these, this becomes a very powerful motivating force to engage in the spiritual path and free ourselves from suffering, and if we're so inclined, work for enlightenment to free all others from suffering as well. So these 5 remembrances then are very powerful, very helpful for our spiritual practice. But I think that they can also help with grief, because understanding that I'm not the only one who goes through these experiences, others do as well. That can really help dispel the sense of loneliness. So, when someone has lost a loved one and is experiencing grief, or any kind of grief, losing a job or whatever. So anytime we experience grief, it's very painful. And our mind might make up the story, oh, nobody else feels the way I do. Everybody else is happy. Everybody else is having a good time. I'm the only one who's got this problem. Sometimes our mind, says things like that, which are just rubbish. That's completely untrue. And so, and thinking that way just exacerbates our suffering. It makes things worse. And so if we think, well, I'm not the only one, even at this very moment where I'm having this suffering, there are many others, hundreds, thousands, millions of other people who are also going through this kind of experience. So then we don't feel so alone. And if we're skillful, that way of thinking, that contemplation, can also open up our heart with compassion and feel, oh, I understand how all those other people are feeling. How wonderful if they could be free of this suffering. I want to help them be free. So those kind of thoughts are much more helpful and constructive when we're suffering. If we're able to remember those thoughts and bring them into our mind. So there were a couple of questions. Before I go on, I'll take care of these questions that were sent in. So one is from Valerian. And the question is, when I caught COVID in 2020, I never got better. I already had several autoimmune disorders, but I gained another life-threatening one and the ones I had got worse. I am now permanently in pain and have two technically life-threatening autoimmune disorders. I have so much grief when I think of that summer with the smoke from the fires blocking out the sun and people dying so fast there were refrigerated trucks outside hospitals to hold the bodies. I feel less grief in my day-to-day life than I used to, but I'm truly haunted by that memory. How do I take good care of my grief so that it doesn't overwhelm me when I think of it? Think about it. So what comes to my mind is that it might be helpful to contemplate dependent arising, which simply means contemplating how whatever occurs depends on other things. For example, causes and conditions. So, the events of that year, COVID appearing and just all these horrific things happening, so many people dying and so on. So that was the result of so many factors, so many causes and conditions coming from, many different places, many different directions, and also building up over time. And so it isn't just one person's fault or, one single cause that brought that about, but many factors, many causes and conditions. And from the Buddhist point of view, we say that one of the factors that plays into experiences that people have, human beings or other kinds of beings, is karma. So we each have our own individual karma. And then they also talk about collective karma, which is, a group of people experiencing something together. And that occurs as a result of having done something together in a previous life. So, according to that view, the human beings on this planet who had that experience of COVID hitting us, this must have been the result of all of us in some previous time doing something together, something negative. It must have been a negative action together. So, for example, sometimes a war, when there's a war between two countries and, many people in one country are getting involved in fighting the other side. And even those not directly involved in the fighting might be contributing to the war in other ways. Even just mentally supporting the war and being happy whenever our side kills a bunch of people on the other side and so on. So that's an example of how a large group of people can create collective karma, negative karma in that case. We can also create collective virtuous karma when we do something virtuous together with a number of other people. So if a group of people creates some negative karma, then that creates the cause for experiencing something collectively sometime later in the future, which could be, years, thousands of years, millions of years down the line. So a Buddhist would contemplate that, think in terms of karma, and that can alleviate some of the unhappiness and anxiety that we experience. And it can also motivate us to be super careful about our karma from now on. Like, okay, this is what happens if you create bad karma, and I don't like this happening, so I better stop creating bad karma and create good karma instead. So that's one way of transforming tragic situations into something helpful for our spiritual practice. So that's just the first thing that popped into mind. Um, and another thing is impermanence, just remembering that things change, things are not permanent. So the events of that year, it was only 3 years ago, but things have changed since then. Hopefully that situation will never happen again, but just to understand that that's the past. It's over, and things are not the same now. Things have changed. And also, sometimes good things come out of tragedies. So when there's a tragedy like that, people become more aware, and new policies are uh, created in society and governments, and also just the fact that tragedy often brings out compassion. There were so many acts of amazing compassion during that time. And so those are just some examples of positive things that came out of that tragic situation. So it's good to remember those, and not only focus on the bad things, but focus on the positive things as well. But I was also thinking that, yeah, if you have difficulty dealing with the grief on your own, then please seek help. Because it sounds, when I read what you wrote, I couldn't help but wonder if this might be a case of traumatic grief. I don't know, enough to say that for sure, but yeah, it could be that a counselor, a therapist could help you with that. And one thing that helps with trauma is EMDR, which stands for, I forget what it is, something about eye movement. And it's quite a simple technique. And within a short time, it can have very powerful effects, helping people recover from trauma. So they're using it with people, even like veterans who suffer trauma in war, and rape victims, abuse victims, and so on. So it's found to be very helpful, very effective, and very simple for transforming the way we, think about and deal with past um, traumatic experiences or other kinds of painful experiences. So, yeah, that might be something to consider. Um, yeah, there it is. Eye movement desensitization therapy, something like that. But it's a long title, so just EMDR for short is good. Okay, then there was another question from Tukje. A few years ago at the Abbey, answering a question of mine about grief, a monastic said that grief was not an affliction. I have been very confused about this since. It seems that from your teaching today, grief is considered an affliction, as it will no longer be experienced from the path of seeing. My question is grief an afflicted state of mind based on ignorance, or can there be grief based on wisdom? I understand that it would not necessarily be skillful to say to someone who is grieving that it is an affliction, but knowing that it is could help me figure out antidotes. So, this is a good question. And, grief is not normally listed on the lists of afflictions. Like we have 6 root afflictions and 20 secondary afflictions, and grief is not on any of those lists. So I'm not sure where it would fall, where it would be categorized, but what my thought is that it might be the mental factor of feeling, unhappy feeling. So feeling is one mental factor that's ever present. Every single moment we have a feeling with every perception, every thought, every experience we have. And there's 3 kinds of feelings: pleasant or happy feeling, unpleasant or unhappy feeling, and then neutral or indifferent feeling. So I'm just guessing. I'm not sure. I could check with Geshe-la, But I think that, yeah, grief could simply be an unhappy feeling. And unhappy feelings are not necessarily afflictions, as in the explanation on, the four foundations of mindfulness, or the four establishments of mindfulness. One of those is mindfulness of feeling, and there you contemplate different kinds of feelings. And one way of dividing feelings is into worldly and spiritual feelings. So, worldly feelings are the ones we have just with our ordinary activities and sensory experiences. But spiritual feelings are those associated with our spiritual practice, and and in both those categories, worldly and spiritual feelings, there are pleasant ones. There's also unpleasant ones. So there are unpleasant feelings that are spiritual. So to me, it's clear that, feeling unhappy or having unpleasant feelings isn't necessarily afflictive. When we contemplate death, impermanence, for example, we may sometimes have an unhappy feeling, an unpleasant feeling, but that's spiritual because, um, we it's part of our practice. It comes up in the context of our practice. Eventually, we get beyond such unpleasant feelings, but just having an unpleasant feeling, the point I'm trying to make isn't necessarily afflictive. However, having said that, I think it could be that when having grief, when having feelings of grief, that there could be afflictions involved, such as attachment. So when you're feeling grief, you're thinking about a person who passed away and having a strong attachment to that person, wishing that they were still here. So that would be clearly an affliction. And maybe also anger. Sometimes there's anger related to grief. Angry at that person for abandoning you. We're angry at, the situation that you're in. Why did this have to happen to me? Other people still have their kids or their husband or their wife, why me? So again, that's an affliction. So what we need to do is observe our mind when we are feeling grief, and then just try to um, determine what's going on there, and see if we notice attachment, anger, or any of the other afflictions. And if we do recognize an affliction, then apply the appropriate antidote to that. And you asked if grief, can there be grief based on wisdom? I mean, what comes to mind is, sometimes the Dalai Lama cries. I've actually seen it when he's teaching, and he starts talking about sentient beings and their suffering, and he just starts crying. I mean, you could say that's like grief, maybe grief that sentient beings are suffering. I don't know. It's hard to say. I can't say for somebody else's mind, but it's possible that, yeah, there could be grief based on wisdom. And also, there's this story of Marpa. Marpa was the teacher of Milarepa, and he was considered a very highly accomplished being, even an enlightened being. Some say he was an enlightened being. And there's this story. He was a layman and had a wife and children, and one of his sons died. He was thrown from a horse and died. And Marpa wept, just, put his robe over his head and just cried. And some of his disciples saw him crying like that and said, "But you told us that everything is like an illusion. And so why are you crying?" And Marpa said, this is one version of the story. He said, "It's true. everything is like an illusion or like a dream. But losing a child is like a nightmare, a super illusion. Nothing is more painful than the death of one's child. This intense grief is also unreal and illusory. And then the next day he said, my afflictions sometimes seem as if carved in stone, but even stone is nothing but clear light. Momentary appearances are all self-manifesting and self-liberating. This realization is the heart's sure release. So I think that those statements are related to the practice of Mahamudra. He was a great practitioner of Mahamudra. So anyway, it kind of sounds like he's saying that this grief, this weeping he had over the death of his son was due to afflictions. Yeah, but still, that doesn't necessarily mean that grief itself is an affliction. So I'm just not sure. So I think the best thing is when you have an experience of grief is to, look at your mind and examine what's going on. And there's probably a number of things going on. And you might notice among those things happening that there are some afflictions. And in that case, it would be good to deal with those. And then you asked the second question about how can grief be transformed into beneficial states of mind. And that's what I will talk about tomorrow morning. So hang on until then. Okay, so I got some more things to share today, this afternoon. This is more from the Western perspective. So there's lots of information on the website about grief and different kinds of grief and different stages of grief and so on. So this is just from one website called WebMD, which usually has very good advice about different kinds of medical issues, but also psychological, emotional ones as well. So, on that website, it said grief is a natural response to losing someone or something that's important to you. You may feel a variety of emotions, including anger, sadness, or loneliness. You may also experience physical symptoms such as tiredness, headaches, upset stomach, joint pain, changes in appetite and sleep, and there were others mentioned as well. So I think it is helpful. I know it was helpful for me when I was experiencing grief after the death of my mother, and I read a book about grief, and it was helpful to read about other people's experiences and just to know that what I was experiencing was normal or typical, because you have these strange experiences, maybe things you've never experienced before, and you wonder what's going on. Am I going mad? So just to know that it's typical. Many other people have those experiences too, and they are temporary. That they're not going to last. They're just there for a while, and eventually they will pass. And if they're like strong or severe, then you can seek help from your doctor, from a therapist, and so on. So there's help available if you need that. So you need to get to know yourself, and if these symptoms are too strong, you're not able to manage them, or they just go on and on and on and don't seem to end, then maybe it is time to seek help from professionals. And then the third bullet point says that you can experience grief for different reasons. Maybe a loved one died, a relationship ended, or you lost your job, other life changes. such as chronic illness or moving to a new home, can also lead to grief. So again, there's many different situations that can occur where we would have these experiences of grief, experiences related to grief. And yeah, it's just helpful to know and to say to ourselves, oh, I'm feeling this way because of this situation, having lost a loved one or moving to a new home or whatever. So that can give some ease, some comfort to the mind. And then it says, everyone grieves differently. So everyone has a different experience. There's no two experiences of grief that are identical. But if you understand your emotions, take care of yourself, and seek support, you can heal. So that's important to keep in mind, because sometimes our mind might say that what we're experiencing now is going to be there forever. It's permanent. Buddhism says no. Nothing is permanent in our experience. So all of our thoughts and our feelings and whatever is going on with us is not permanent. It's transitory, subject to change. It will pass. Things will get better. So if you ever notice that kind of thought happening in your mind, oh, I'm going to feel this way forever, it's never going to go away, then it is important to not believe that. Don't believe what your mind is saying. It's not true. So I don't know, for me, impermanence, just reminding myself of impermanence is so helpful in many situations. Just to say to myself, okay, this is happening now and it's not pleasant, but it's not going to last forever. It will change. And while you're waiting for it to change, you don't have to just sit there and suffer. There are things we can do. And I will talk about that tomorrow. I'll talk about some methods from the Buddhist tradition we can use to deal with the painful experiences that we're having, that alleviate the suffering, but also help us transform this experience into spiritual practice, into the path, helping us move along the path and get closer to enlightenment. And then the next slide is also from the Western tradition. So there are different lists of stages of grief. For example, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, who did a lot of work with death and dying, came up with a list of 5 stages of grief. And then this book, Good Grief, lists 10 stages of grief. Both of those 2 lists were enumerated back in the 60s, I think. And more recently, it seems therapists and counselors and so on are using this model of 7 stages of grief. So this is kind of a middle way between 5 and 10. And also many of the elements on all these lists are similar. So I thought this would be a good list to go through. But we need to keep in mind that not everyone will experience all of these stages. Yeah. So this is just general. Yeah. This is what could happen, but it may not happen to you, all of these stages. You might experience some of them, but not all of them. And also in terms of the order, they're not always experienced in the same order. So we shouldn't hold this kind of list as, hard and fast rule and then start getting anxious because we didn't experience one of these stages, or we experienced one before the other according to this. People can sometimes get all hung up on things like that. So we shouldn't hold to this too tightly, but see it as just a helpful guide. And if we are experiencing something kind of problematic, then we look at this list, we might recognize, oh yeah, I recognize that one. That's what I'm experiencing. So that's one of the typical stages of grief. And that can help just to not get too anxious. And again, to know that it's just a stage. It's transitory, not permanent. So the first stage here is shock and denial. So our initial reaction to a loss, especially something, quite strong like the death of a loved one, might be shock. It's like our mind says, no, can't be true. I don't believe it. Um, and denial. Yeah, we might deny, no, 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 they're lying. It's wrong. I have to check up. So, yeah. So these are said to be coping mechanisms because, um, it's hard to accept such a huge change as the death of a loved one or the loss of job. Yeah, and so having some shock and denial in the beginning is like a cushion to ease the difficult experience, and it's transitory. It'll go away, eventually. I hope. I guess I don't know. There might be some people who just stay in denial. That wouldn't be very helpful. Yeah, but sooner or later, yeah, our mind does have to accept the reality of what's happened. And then the second is pain and guilt. So the pain is, just this feeling of it's unbearable. Yeah, this loss is just unbearable. I can't bear it. It's horrible. Um, and then guilt could be because you may feel that because of what you're going through, these difficult emotions you're going through, you might be causing problems for others, making others' lives difficult. So that's one reason for guilt. But also, um, I've heard that, and I experienced this too, that, after the loss of a loved one, we might start thinking about things we did that we shouldn't have done, or things that we didn't do but we should have done. And maybe we did something that, you know, brought on the death more quickly than otherwise. So, feeling guilty in relation to the person who passed away. So that's another reason for guilt. And if it's not helpful to get stuck on that. So it would be good to clear that up either on your own, like do a reality check, or talk with somebody who could help you accept that you are not responsible. Then, third is anger and bargaining. So people can sometimes be angry at various objects. You might be angry at the person who died, like, why did you leave me? Angry at people who you think were responsible for the death, anger at God, anger at the universe, anger at yourself. So, yeah, we say even inanimate objects we could get angry at. So we're just angry that we're in this situation where we have so much pain and, this isn't what we wanted. We didn't want this to happen. So our anger can just, start getting directed at different objects. So just to know that that's normal, but within Buddhism, of course, we understand anger to be an affliction and harmful, and certainly not helpful to anybody. And there's lots of antidotes we can use to work on anger. So if you do have anger, look for ways of managing that. Bargaining is said to be because you feel helpless and vulnerable and look for ways to gain control. And so your mind might start thinking of things like, if only I had done this, if only I had done that, if only this had happened, da 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 da. Like, trying to rewrite the script to bring things back to how they were before. And people who believe in God will sometimes try to bargain with God, like, I promise, if you would just bring this person back, give this person back to me, I promise I will do this or do that, or stop doing such and such and such. Yeah, so just trying to bargain our way out of the pain that we're experiencing. Number 4 is depression. So this may be a period of isolation and loneliness during which you're processing and reflecting on the loss. And you might have thoughts like, how can I go on? Or what am I without that person? You may have feelings of despair, hopelessness. And again, your mind might think, this is it. I'm going to feel like this way I'm going to feel like this forever. I'm never going to recover from this. So it's important to recognize that is not the case. That is not true, especially if you do seek help to heal the process of grieving. It will change. It will pass. Well, pass maybe isn't the right word. Like in that story I mentioned about Heather who lost the baby, and the other woman saying that she also lost a baby 35 years ago, and she thought of that child every single day. And, don't let anyone tell you that you've been grieving too long. Yeah, so, you know, depending on who it was that passed away and how close you were and so on, then yeah, there may be traces of grief that continue the rest of your life. That may happen, but it won't be the same. I think over time, usually, over time, you adjust. And the very strong, painful feelings you have initially will not last. They will calm down. And then number 5, the upward turn. So at this stage, the feeling, feelings like anger and pain have died down, and you're left in a more calm and relaxed state. Okay, so at some point there'll be this switch where, yeah, you're starting to emerge from the really strong feelings of pain and grief. And then reconstruction and working through. Here you begin to put the pieces of your life back together and move forward. And, again, there's no fixed amount of time that this process will take. So it would vary from one person to the other. And also what you're doing, if you're using skillful methods for working on your grief, where you get stuck somewhere. So again, if you do feel like you're stuck somewhere, seek help. There's lots of grief counselors. There's also groups, groups where people who are going through grief can get together and share their experiences. And I can imagine that's really helpful. You have people you can talk to who understand what you're going through because they're going through it as well, or have gone through it and can sort of pull you along and encourage you. So I can imagine that would be very helpful to get involved with. And then acceptance and hope, the last one. So this is a very gradual acceptance of the new way of life and a feeling of possibility for the future. So I'm going to suggest that you bring to mind an experience you have had of grief. And if there's an experience of grief that is very powerful, like it's maybe still fresh and raw, and if you bring that one to mind, you may become overwhelmed by sadness and grief and so on. So you don't need to choose that one. Yeah, you could choose another one. Yeah, when we work on um, experiences, like, trying to learn from them, transform them, and so on. It's sometimes better to start with those experiences that are milder, not so huge and strong and overwhelming, because if we bring those to mind, then our mind just can just get totally carried away with emotions, and it's difficult to really meditate or use that situation skillfully. So it can be helpful to start with milder, smaller experiences of grief, like in this case, and then gradually get used to working on that. And then with more familiarity, you can take on bigger ones and eventually the really big ones. So it's up to you, but that's just a suggestion. So make yourselves comfortable. And leave aside other thoughts not related to this meditation, like what you're going to do later tonight or whatever, and really have the determination to keep your mind focused on this meditation. Bring your mind back if it does wander away. Now, I invite you to bring to mind an experience of grief that you had in the past. Again, it might be best to choose one that wasn't too huge, strong, overwhelming, something that was milder. And start by just reviewing that experience. Just thinking about, what happened and what your reactions were, how you felt. Don't get into great depth or detail, but just in a simple way, as if you were telling a story about this to somebody, but you don't have hours and hours of time to do so. So just kind of stick to the basics. And then, having just gone through that list of stages of grief that people often experience, see if you can recognize if you had any of those stages as you were dealing with that experience of loss. And also, see if you can recall things that were helpful for you during that time, whether things other people did or said, or things you yourself thought of and did. And finally, see if you can prepare for future experiences of loss, which will probably happen, um, based on what you found helpful in those previous experience. Um, so think about how you could use your previous experiences to help you deal with future losses so that they are not as painful and overwhelming, and that you can even transform them into something positive, beneficial. So I noticed in the chat box a couple of questions related to what I was saying before in response to Tukche's question. Doesn't grief occur because we see things ignorantly? Doesn't a direct realization of emptiness remove the cause for grief? I think so. I don't know. I'm not there. I haven't had that realization. But yeah, as I mentioned, when the Buddha passed away and his disciples, who were arhats, meaning they had this realization of emptiness and their minds were free of all afflictions, they did not suffer. They did not experience grief, even when the Buddha passed away. So, yeah, I think with the realization of how things exist, then there would no longer be grief. And then, secondly, isn't there a difference between grief and compassion? Yes. In fact, in the Buddha's teachings, it mentions enemies of compassion, love, the four measurables. And with regard to compassion, the far enemy of compassion is cruelty. That's like totally opposite to compassion, cruelty. And the near enemy of compassion, well, there's a few near enemies, but one is grief. So it does mention that grief. So a near enemy means something that looks like compassion, but it isn't. So it has some similarities, but it's not really compassion. So yeah, so grief is said to be a near enemy of compassion. But I think the point I'm trying to make is it's not necessarily an affliction. I mean, it's certainly painful, but as Tucci pointed out, if we think of it as an affliction, that may not be so helpful when we're in the midst of grief or somebody else is experiencing grief. But it comes from afflictions, and it's usually associated with afflictions. But I'm still not sure if it itself would be considered an affliction. So I'll look into that. Maybe I'll have an answer by tomorrow. So we have a break now until 4:30, and then Venerable Chunyi will lead a discussion, and you'll have a chance to talk more, and listen to others, and then have a wrap up of the discussion afterwards. And then I will see you tomorrow at the same time as this morning, 10 to 11:30, and then tomorrow I'll talk more about Buddhist methods for working with situations where we have grief so that we can actually transform this painful experience into something productive, constructive, something that will help us progress along the path. So let's just mentally dedicate the merit, the positive energy we've created during this session to awakening for all living beings.